Hi everyone, Mitch here. I'm here again with another RPG Talks book review. Today we're going to be focusing on The Complete Book of Elves by Colin McComb. This was published by TSR in 1992 and may very well be the most, let's say, controversial of the Brown Player's Handbook splatbooks. So much so that this book was apologized for publicly by the author in 2013 as part of a crowdsourcing for his new work. One of the rewards was that he would put a public apology for this book on YouTube, and it was done. It was very interesting. If anybody is curious, they can definitely check that out. But I wanted to take a look at this book and see if it was really worth all of the hand-wringing and frankly, complaining that the community in general gave to it. So let's go ahead and get into it. This is a long book. It tops out at over 170 pages. And as you can see, quite a few chapters, so we're going to go a little faster than my normal overview. The chapter 1 is pretty self-explanatory. It actually goes through a general creation myth of the elves, and probably the coolest thing about it is it actually shows a literal elven tree of creation, so you can see where the different events in the history of the elves happened and how they branched off into the sub-races that the book presents. And that leads us into chapter 2, which is just entitled Variations on a Theme. And this is where it talks about the different sub-races that the book presents. And the book presents a total of 5 sub-races: the aquatic elves, the drow or the dark elves, the gray elves, the high elves, and the sylvan elves, with the high elves being the sub-race that was presented originally in the player's handbook. And it literally just goes through kind of a description of each of the elves and kind of their places in the world, a little bit about their personalities, that sort of thing. And then it talks about the half-elves as well. Now, the one thing that I like that kind of sets this chapter apart, particularly compared to the other books in this racial series, is then it goes into each of the published campaign worlds at that time and talks a little bit about how elves are presented in each of those campaign worlds, so that you know kind of how to use this information in those campaigns. And the end of that chapter has another sort of elven tree, and this talks about how the elves kind of break off into the elves that populate each campaign world, which could seem a little silly until you realize this was the era of Spelljammer, in which the general thinking of TSR at this time was that all of their campaign worlds existed in the same universe that could be reached by spell-jamming ships flying through various crystal spheres. So I thought that was kind of neat, particularly for players who don't stick to one campaign world. If you play with multiple campaign worlds, this is interesting information. Chapter 3 goes into the physical attributes of the elves, and this is, I think, the point where people start having problems with this book. First of all, there's at each of these chapters, there's an in-character little blurb spoken from the point of view of an elf. And this is the first one where you start getting a little bit of that racial superiority that is commonly attributed to the elves. And while it's interesting and you get a lot of in-character feel for it, it can get a little grating as the book goes on. But the real problem as the physical attributes chapter starts is that this is where we start seeing the elven fanboyness of Mr. McComb. Basically, this chapter can be summed up as the elves are better than anything and better at everything. It goes through like your normal stuff about the Elven sight, i.e. infravision. But then they talk about like this ability of manifestation, which makes elves just they have this ability to seem bigger and more important than they really are, and it actually gives game mechanics to that effect, and just some kind of silly stuff like that. The chapter ends with a sort of a discussion of the different stages of elven life, and then some discussions about uh, elven bonding with each other, elven music, and with this general theme of anything you can do, elves can do better. And that leads us into chapter 4, which is mental attributes, which again continues this elven superiority idea, um, and talks a little bit about their outlook on life, which is frankly a little schizophrenic. It talks about how elves have this view of time and it's long and they can ponder things forever, but in the same time, if moved to action, they can move quickly and more decisively than any other race. So it's just another kind of example of the elves are better. And it goes into the elvish attitudes towards other races and that sort of thing. Chapter 5 goes into the elven society, talking about the elvish language, various rituals in their society, elvish holy days, talks about elvish marriage. This is one I really like, in part because I guess the talking up the elves kind of tones down in this chapter, and it does give a lot of interesting ideas if you are trying to build a semi-believable elvish society in your campaign world. Then we go into chapter 6, which is the elvish myths, and it's just a few stories about that elves hold, and it's kind of neat, but in general, considering how long this book is and how much is in it, after kind of a read through, it feels like filler more than anything. Then they have this whole chapter on elvish, how elves look on death and their funeral ceremonies. Again, very interesting. I think again this is like this Elven Society chapter. This is one of the more well written chapters, and again, there's a certain lessening of the Elven superiority, but you still get these lines that are just kind of funny if taken out of context, like, and I quote, "It should be noted that elves don't die the way other mortal races do. In fact, elves only rarely suffer true death." Given my experience in campaigning and the number of elvish player characters I have had, I can pretty much vouch for the fact that they die just as well as any other player character. Then they go into elven dwellings, and basically it breaks down the different types of cities for the Grey Elves, the High Elves, and the Sylvan Elves. I thought it was weird that they left out the Aquatic Elves and the Drow if they're going to be kind of giving this overarching impression of everybody. So that chapter just kind of seems unfinished, frankly. Then we go into optional rules. And this is where we start ramping up the crazy. And I mean that in the nicest way possible. But this is basically just extra rules to make your elves better than everybody else. They talk about giving extra proficiencies based on the lifespan of the elves, based on the age that you start them at. They talk about various combat modifications, including introducing probably one of the most argued about points in this book, the Blade Song fighting style, which essentially allows elven fighter mages to cast spells with their blades in their hands and actually get benefits from doing so. And then they go into elvish archery. And again, it's just look at all of these cool trick shots and stuff that only elves can do. And it's just, again, more and more and more cool stuff for the elves. Then we get to chapter 10, where we finally, at page 76 of the book, get into how to create an elf. I think it's weird that the whole section, in place of the gray box where they normally have in-character discussion, is a random elf generator. So you can, with, 6, 7 dice rolls, create an elf out of whole cloth, pretty much. Then it goes into the actual mechanical discussions of each of the elven subraces, which are okay. The one thing I was glad they did on the elven subraces that get a little crazy, specifically the Grey Elves and the Drow, who have powers far beyond those of mortal elves, they actually hit them with an experience point cost to be that race. Elves have to pay an additional 20% experience to level, and the Grey Elves have to pay 15. So that kind of helps balance them out, but I'll be honest, there's more of the overpowering coming from the optional rules and the kits, as we'll discuss coming up, than really the races, so I don't know that it's done much to balance it out. Then we get into the kits. The kits balance are well, balance probably wasn't the big focus here. The priest kit is, it's an herbalist. It's cool, nothing super powerful. But then we get into like the archer kit, which is just ridiculous. The archer can fire faster than most people, or get bonuses on trick shots, and can change what she wants to do with that from round to round. So, on top of that, apparently elven archers are so badass that just being around them makes their bow and arrow more dangerous, because if they keep their bow and arrow for a month, it starts causing additional point of damage every shot. And it's just silly rules like that that make some of these kits just really, really overpowered. Probably the worst of all of them is the Bladesinger, and the blade singing style is kind of ridiculous anyway, as I alluded to a minute ago. But the Fighter Mage kit for Bladesinger takes it and just kicks it up a crazy notch. And the only real downside to it is all role-playing attached, which, for a game like the one I run, I can make that matter. But one of the big complaints at the time this book came out with was that the Bladesinger got so many mechanical bonuses. They're just flat better than fighters and mages, basically. And that there was, quote-unquote, no disadvantages. But if you're playing an actual role-playing game where the character's actions matter and they help frame the story, having to just drop anything you do to lend aid to any elf in need should be more of a pain in the butt to a character than any mechanical disadvantage. So I kind of disagree with some of those folks who say there are no negatives to it. And it just goes on. It really, there's several different kits for each of the class combinations, and not all of them are super busted, but enough of them are that it really kind of ups the power level of elves. And all of these kits are exclusively elven only. The understanding is that only the elves are cool enough to take these kits. But I really, depending upon your campaign world, I don't see any real problem with letting other groups use them, but sort of your mileage may vary there. Then we get into Chapter 11, which is Elvish Equipment. And this is kind of a weird hodgepodge of various stuff. It talks about fairy wine and different materials and harps, and then you get a couple of different arrows. You get an elven bow, which is strong enough to be able to be used as a club, which is kind of cool. And then it ends this little chapter with the discussion of elven plate mail, which is basically the elven chainmail we all know and love, but even better. Which is pretty much the theme of this whole book. Chapter 12 is the magic of elves, and really all it is it's a list of several spells that are elf appropriate, and a few magic items at the end. I'll be honest, this is probably the weakest area of the book in terms of just pure power crank up, which I guess compared to the rest of the book is a good thing. Then the end of this chapter is kind of takes a left turn off into weird again. And it talks about semi-magical artificial limbs. And when I was younger and I got this book originally, I passed over this section thinking it's kind of silly and not really paying it too much mind. Now that I'm older and I've gone through this book again, it really seems kind of ableist. The book really talks about how the elves fear maiming and loss of limbs more than anything. And it really kind of paints the idea of people who are scarred or are handicapped as being even more subhuman than the elves make all of the other races. And so it's kind of a weird, uncomfortable little section to read, at least to me. Again, your mileage may vary on that one, but it just seems like a weird and unnecessary thing to tack into the end of that chapter. Then the book ends with maybe the strongest section in the whole book. And it's a quick discussion of Elven Campaigns and kind of different things to think about, how to make campaigns that are in sort of elf-centric worlds, which theoretically, with all of the powers this book has given them, the elves would soon rule any campaign world. But it's nice because it gives you a couple of different ideas, and it's just a few short blurbs, like 4 or 5 paragraphs about each type of world. And though I've never completely copied anything out of this, it's certainly good for mining for ideas. The end of the book is appendix, which is actually good because this book is long enough where being able to look up and reference things certainly helps. And then there's 2 monster manual pages, one on the Avariel, which are winged elves, and the other on Kushi, which are elven hunting dogs. And then, like all of these complete whatever books, they end with some very nicely fleshed out character sheet pages, which can be very helpful to some folks. So, overall general thoughts. Pros. There is a huge amount of in-character information about the elves in this book. If you have never played a D&D world and you want to know what elves are, this gives you an idea of at least one certain view of elves, and it does that very, very in-depth. I don't think I could think of a single thing that I would want to know about elves that this book does not give an answer to. 2, the book has been very enjoyable to read. It is very immersive, and they keep, with the number of chapters, they kind of keep the mechanics into one side and the fluff into another, which again helps with that immersion quite a bit. And lastly, there's a wide variety of sub-races and kits to play with. If your DM opens this book up and says, hey, take what you want, there's combinations to literally last you for years. In fact, I've been playing for certainly as long as this book has been out, and I have yet to utilize either as PCs or NPCs every combination in this book. I just don't think it works. Now, in terms of cons, most of the in-character writing comes off as extremely arrogant and borderline racist in a lot of elements. I also talked about the little part about the magical limbs and its ableist tendencies, which, depending upon how you want to read that, could be borderline problematic. But as I said earlier, you would certainly get a point of view on elves from this book, and that point of view is basically that elves are arrogant bastards. Which, if that works for your campaign, great, you'll get miles out of this book. If not, and if you want to represent your elves as being a little less self-absorbed, it might not be necessarily the best thing to show your newer players. And that leads into point 2. According to this book, the elves have no weaknesses. They are presented as the best at everything. And I think this gets worse comparing it to the other race books, because while I think the other race books do a good job representing their races, they don't seem to be nearly as one-sided as this one is. They do admit to failings or weak points of their race, and Mr. McComb was going to have none of that. The elves are super cool, and that's all he wants to hear about it, which, to a certain degree, is understandable, as that's really the same position that Tolkien took. So you can't really fault the guy for following the master there. And last point, it seems to me at least that balance was not a design concern in this book at all. You read through it, and you definitely see that it was written with the rule of cool in mind, which makes a certain amount of sense considering that Mr. McComb was 22, I believe, when he wrote this. So you definitely get this sort of elf fanboy feeling about a lot of it, where he's just like, oh, this would be cool if elves could do this. And somehow it went down and made it through the editing process. So I think it's a good book, but it is one book that the DM needs to be very careful with in terms of opening. You're not going to have every campaign be able to use everything in this book, because there are serious balance issues. The Bladesinger, if you are not careful, will outshine both your fighter and your mage. The Archer, again, if you're not careful, will be way better than half of your characters. And God forbid if blade singing spreads. I mean, if your whole party gets blade singing as the proficiency, you're going to be hard pressed to come up with good encounters for the party, because it really is kind of unbalancing. But if you kind of pick and choose what you allow in and keep it within reason, I think it can add a lot to a campaign. And so, general thoughts. My summation for this one is a little hard. I'm going to give this book 3.5 out of 5 stars. There's definitely some big weaknesses in it, but they're big weaknesses that I think can be overcome with a competent DM. Also, it's just a fun book to read. It's certainly, I would say, one of the most immersive of the complete books, and there's a lot to be said for that. It's one of those books that's just fun to sit down and read. And so I can't really bottom it out for that, but I definitely think it reads, in terms of your balance, reads more like a first draft than a final product. But yeah, I could feel safe with that. I don't feel like I'm throwing away my credibility by giving it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Alright guys, well thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe. If you have any of your own thoughts about the complete Book of Elves, please leave them in the comments below. And if you have an idea for a product that was released during the run of 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, please let me know. I certainly want to do reviews of anything you guys are interested in. If you have a favorite book and want to hear my thoughts about it, or simply are considering making a purchase and don't really know if the book is worthwhile, I have a whole heck of a lot of them, and I'm happy to do these videos to help share some of my expertise. So, again, thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll catch you on the next video.